Hey everyone, John here. Welcome back to another Sapphire tutorial. This time we're going to take a look at how I created this look inspired by the Mission Impossible trailer. And we're going to break it down, and at the end we're going to create a Sapphire Effect Builder preset together. And you can follow along because we've made the project file available. So go ahead and download that and let's get started. Alright, so here in the main composition, going to come down and just isolate these three layers, just solo those. These are the ones we see at the very beginning. And I've followed the trailer graphics to some extent. In the trailer graphics, if you take a look at them, it starts off with this red stroked text and kind of smoky and has a flare on the front. So I've definitely used it as inspiration, but I've also, used my own creative license later in the look. So we'll take a look inside this composition. So the text is Agency FB Black Condensed. I didn't have the italicized version, so that's why I've done that in this comp using Warp Transform. We'll look at that in a sec. But this is really simple. A couple of scale keyframes, just scaling back. Okay, so it's live text and it's got a stroke on it. So back in here, what I'll do is just isolate that one. So in the actual look, if we just unsolo these, it actually goes really bright like that. Okay. So rather than doing everything on one stroke layer, I've just separated them. So this one is the one that is the sort of smoky red one at the beginning. And then this one here starts red, but then does that. This one here, you can see how I've keyframed the color to go from red to yellow. And then with Ultra Glow, just keyframed the brightness, fall off, and bias. So it starts off really glowy, and then that glow kinds of fades. So like I said, I tried to match the trailer, and that's why I've keyframed this the way I have. So we put those both together. So it starts off smoky, and for this, just rewinding a little bit here, we just choose the right layer and turn these off. So fill to fill it with red, warp transform by adjusting the shear value. I can create that italicized version, and Ultra Glow, and I've named that Red Atmos because I've used the atmosphere values in here just to give it that smoky look. And quite a fast speed here. It's only visible for a few frames, so I wanted it to be obvious that the smoke was moving. At its default, we just reset that of 1. Over a few frames, you can see as I'm moving, it hardly looks like it's moving. So I just increase that value just to make it really clear that it's moving. Okay, so that one is just trimmed. If we look at these, they're both doing the same thing. So obviously I created this layer first and then I'd already colorized it to yellow, but then I realized it'd be better to have that as a separate one because it has the atmosphere. So I just trimmed that layer and just continued to work on the one above by adding the glow, which we just looked at before. So it goes from that to that. Now above that we have Sapphire Lens Flare. Once again, just kind of echoing the trailer. You can see we just solo that. Got a couple of keyframes. So for the hotspot, if I just grab the hotspot and move it around, you can see we can create those kinds of crossover animations by animating the hotspot. Let's take a quick look at the presets. Just going to click Load Preset. I always start with the preset because it just saves me so much time. So for this, I'm just going to click on my favorites. I actually use this one, Call Your Girlfriend. You can see it has lots of streaks in it. So I loaded that up and clicked on the Edit Lens button and just turned a few things off, deleted a few things, and just left me with those streaks. Because the streaks are what I really wanted. So in here, I've given it a color of red. And that actually is animated. You can see here on the timeline how it animates from red through this sort of bright yellow, or very pale orange, I should say. And I've also animated the hotspot and the ray length. So they start off with the ray length, they start off quite long, and then they shrink down, become a little bit shorter. So that sits above that. And it does continue throughout the animation. You can see as it crosses over, it comes out the other side. So the one that was on the right comes out the left, and vice versa. And this is nice because it adds a little bit of detail. All right, let's take a look now how that looks with all the different flares. So flare D, and just keep in mind, rather than creating this whole look, if I just turn these all on, rather than creating this whole look using just one sapphire lens flare, I found it easier to control by using multiple layers and splitting them out. So once again, I used the same Call Your Girlfriend preset, but if we just click on Edit Lens, I've basically just deleted everything I didn't need and come in and just modified things in here first, and then used my keyframing inside of After Effects. So you can see starting off very bright and then just animating the brightness down. So that's the base. Adding this one on top. So this one, I've animated the rel height for lens flare. So it's just scaling it down on the Y, like that. And for this one, I've animated scale widths, like that. So it scales out. And there's one more, which gives us a little bright hotspot here. And you can see animating scale widths and brightness. So it's much easier to get full control over the look if I'm, able to access each of these individual flares, widths and brightness and rel height separately. Like that. Okay, so if we turn on the text now, that's the look so far. And just turn on the flare A, just like that. Boom. So it starts off really bright and just goes a little less bright as this particular flare scales out. The width is animated. Okay, so let's go to grid. In the trailer, I noticed there was this kind of really fine grid, and I really like that. Let's take a look at the settings here. So we've got S grid, and I've got a really high box X and box Y value. And I probably want to save this as a preset too because it was very handy. Creates this really fine mesh. And using the same warp transform values, effect and values, just to warp that so it's, on the same angle as the text. Like that. You can see there's that sheer X value changed. Very nice. So the grid sits in there, and it gives it kind of a techie look, I guess, like you're looking at it kind of on a screen or something like that. Right now, I've already turned on this distortion layer. That's what we have so far. But let's look at, first of all, Ultra Glow. So this is Ultra Glow on an adjustment layer. And one thing I was noticing, notice how you can see the grid quite clearly over these hotspots, and we're losing a little bit of this brightness in here. So by adding Ultra Glow above the grid, like that, and coming in and adjusting the threshold and also the glow width, if I just decrease the threshold, you can see that really gets blown out like that. We're just losing a little bit of that sort of layered look. Just turn it off again. So it looks very flat. It's making everything look quite flat. But by just putting it over the top, we're drawing out some of those flares in front of the grid. Okay, it's a classic thing where you put glow on an adjustment layer. So it looks like the glow is wrapping around the layers that are below the adjustment layer. And if you've watched any of my tutorials, you'll see I use that technique all the time. So once again, off and on. Okay, so let's take a look now at this distortion. In the trailer, there's what looks to be like a particle effect behind the text. And I tried to create it with different Sapphire effects, and I just wasn't happy with what I was getting. I mean, besides Sapphire Dust, which isn't a particle effect, but it looks like a particle effect, Sapphire doesn't really have any particles. And rather than get something that I wasn't happy with, I decided to use it as inspiration, but create my own look, which I actually prefer. And this is using distortion. So I'm just going to solo that. And we'll take a look. All right, so let's turn off these effects. All right, so we've got our Mission Impossible text, but it's actually a different version of that, and it's got these points on there. Notice it's got these points. We'll look at that in a moment as to why I've done that. But first of all, let's turn on some of these layers. Okay, so we've got Ultra Glow. We've got Warp Transform again. And it's really squished. Why is that? Because I've actually animated the scale. So it starts quite tall, and then it scales down because I didn't want to have this effect really obvious throughout the look. We'll look at this, why I've done this in a moment. All right, so next is Sapphire Warp Waves, and that's given us a wavy look. Sort of break that up. And Warp Waves has a phase and a phase speed. So there's actually a little bit of movement with those waves. And what really makes this work is Sapphire Distort. Let's turn that on. So you can see how that's distorted that. And what we're doing is we're using a pre-comp, this one here, Grid Map, as the lens. If we just turn that off, that's how it looks, okay? So it looks a little bit weird. Doesn't really suit the look of this. If we just turn some of these layers on. Doesn't really suit the look of this, right? It's kind of puffy and fat. But by using the lens, which is Grid Map, and taking a look at the grid, so it's the same grid as we're using laid over the top, but I've created a white version in here. And we're using that as the lens. So now it takes all of those layers. We just grab this one, takes all of those effects, and it distorts them into the shape of the grid, which is really nice. So we get a much more interesting look. Let's just hide these again. Very nice. Now, one thing I want you to keep in mind when you're working with something like this, I'm working in 4K here. And when I scale that to half, it actually looks different to what it looks like when I'm working at full. So just be careful when you're working, because sometimes you can not realize you're working at half. You can design the look and then you go, hey, hang on, why does it look different when I go full? All right, so just keep that in mind. Okay, so let's just turn these back on, and these are looking really nice, right? Just mentioning it again, why I use those keyframes for scale Y. If we come to the beginning, I want it to be a little bit taller at the front, at the beginning, a little bit taller. And then as we proceeded through the animation, I didn't want it to be so obvious. So I've made it a little smaller. And that's why I've scaled that in the Warp Transform. So it just reduces the size of it. I didn't get rid of it completely, just like they did in the trailer, because I actually kind of like the detail that it added. So just left it in there and just added a little bit of detail behind that. And the reason I use these little points in here, just by creating outlines for the text. Now I've already deleted the text layer, but if we come back into the main comp and come into here, right-clicking on the text and choosing Create Masks from Text. So that's what I did in here. So I created masks, and that allows me to take various points and add points to the mask and just pull them out like that. And the reason I did that was because that breaks this up a little bit. If we come back to the beginning, it breaks it up a bit. Otherwise, it's fairly even all the way across. So this adds these spikes in here. And I thought that looked a little more interesting, just adding those little spikes in there. All right, so this is what we have so far. Now, we'll take a look at damage in a moment. Let's come up to dust. In the trailer, they used what appeared to be particles behind the text. And here, using Sapphire, I was able to get a pretty close approximation by using Sapphire Dust. If I just click Load Preset, I'm pretty sure I started with something that drifted to the right. So in the presets here, if I just type in RIGHT in the search, that'll come up with anything that has the word right in the description or in the name. So I just grab something like slow drift right and then just speeded it up and changed the color. You can see I'm just animating a mask here. In the effect, you can see matte from path is set to mask 1. And there's a few keyframes for the mask and also animating the dust brightness as well. So starting off with a brightness very, very low so we can almost not see it. And we're also masking it off as well and just sort of fading it in. And we get that look. So if we just bring everything else back on, the mask wipes across and reveals those dust points, and it looks pretty effective. So I was very happy with that, and it's very fast as well, Sapphire Dust. Okay, above that we have the text. Let's quickly break this down. So what I'll do is I'll just solo this one. So this is the Boris FX logo, and it's actually a shape layer. I've got the logo in here, so in order to create the shape layer, just right click and chose Create Shapes from Vector Layer. Now for here, you can see there's BORISFX, and there's a few keyframes in this. So to open the B, under Transform, there's a couple of scale keyframes for that group of paths which makes up the B. Let me just turn off these. And the B is scaling on the X. You can see I've deselected the link, so it's scaling on the X, and in the trailer it has that look where the letters are rotating, and you could make them 3D and rotate them in 3D, but I find it's a little better to actually scale them to fake that look, because if you're rotating them in 3D, the perspective makes these letters on the outsides still visible at the very beginning, but by scaling them you can scale them right down to 0. And that means they won't be visible at the start. So set a couple of keyframes for that. And if I just hit E twice on the keyboard, you can see I've actually linked all of the other letters, ORIS, just using the pick whip for the expression. So I just grabbed the pick whip, linked it up to the scale of the B. I'm going to undo that so I don't break it. So Content B, Transform Scale. And that's scaling all of them. Okay. So pretty easy stuff there, basic After Effects. And that's what we have, just like that. We also have Width. And if we just press U there, you can see I've scaled on the X again. And notice I've used an animator for that. I'm not actually animating the scale transform properties of the layer because that would squish the whole layer, all the letters at once. But by using an animator, by clicking on Animate Scale like that, I can actually animate all of the letters separately. They squish all separately. Okay. And to finish off the look, use an adjustment layer with Fill, Transform. Now, why am I using the Transform effect? Because that way I can animate the opacity, and that will affect the opacity of all the layers below the adjustment layer. Handy little trick using the Transform effect. And then Sapphire Rack Defocus to give us a nice defocus look and coming into focus. Somewhat matching the trailer. So back here in main, we have that sitting on top. Okay, so it's just sitting there, comes in at a certain point in time. No other keyframes on that layer. And to integrate that into the look and to do the final amount of glow on this, just using a couple of adjustment layers with Ultra Glow. You can see, once again, as with the grid, that pulls the glow from the layers below, the brightness from the layers below, and gives us that more integrated look. So it wraps that glow around. And this one here is just around the text area. Just turn that off and on. We've got a couple of keyframes here. You can see I just use that at the beginning to add a little bit of extra glow on the whole thing. If we turn that off, we got that. I just thought it wasn't quite bright enough, but I didn't want to affect the background because it was making the flares in the background blow out too much on the side. So I just isolated that using a mask and just keyframe the brightness so it's nice and bright at the beginning and goes right down to actually 0. So we don't see any of that ultra glow towards the end of the animation. And this one here, this one has a couple of keyframes at the beginning. So the threshold is animated and decreasing the threshold to give us more glow. So less glow here. So if we would decrease the threshold at the beginning, it blows it out too much. So animating the threshold, I can have it nice and low and then nice and high here to give it a super glow. And then animating it up a little bit there. To just finish that look. But really importantly, with that text, having the adjustment layer above it so it feels integrated with the glow, because without it, we got that, and it just doesn't quite work. And that's why I added that second keyframe for the threshold, just to sort of dial in the enough glow for the text, but not too much for the background, the layers below it. So that's basically the overall look, and it's pretty much was where I got to thinking I had this finished. And then I just felt that I just needed a little more detail. And this is where I really, separated from what I saw at the trailer, where I really diverged and added this damage layer. It's not a huge amount of difference. I mean, when I turn it on there, it's hard to see even what's going on. It's very subtle. I'm going to solo it, and we're going to break this down. So starting off with Sapphire Grid. So once again, a fine grid, but we haven't actually got any horizontal grid lines. We're only using vertical grid lines for this. Sapphire Digital Damage. And I want to make sure that this is easy to see. So come and turn on tritone so we can see it, okay? There we go. So it's very subtle because I've made it, purposely made it very subtle. But you can see, there it is there. If I turn off tritone, there we can see it. All right. So come back to Digital Damage. If I wanted to add a lot more, notice in here I've only got block noise turned on. So if I wanted to add a lot more damage, what I need to do is adjust the blocks. So if I increase the intensity, I can make that brighter, and decrease the threshold, then I can add way more blocks, okay? But I didn't want that much. We might come back and adjust that in a minute. Let's bring these back on and turn that on just for now. So that's what we've got there. Now I use Warp Transform because I didn't want it to be straight up and down. I want it to be at the same angle as the main grid. So once again, doing that, which is really nice. S-Tritone. So with S-Tritone, making the whites a bright yellow and the grays an orange. We get a nice sort of variation in there. Didn't look quite as good white. And parallax strips. Sapphire parallax strips, one of my favorite effects. So putting those strips in it. You can see it actually does that kind of thing as well. If we turn it off, because it's creating strips, parallax strips basically splits the layer up into strips and, separates them, pulls them apart. And I used a preset for this. We just click load preset. I use one of these, it's very difficult to see here because it's so fine. But I use one of these thin diagonal ones. I think it's one of the ones that I created, this ultra thin diagonal. And just adjusted some of the settings, took out the diagonal look to that, made it more horizontal. And it gives you these nice strips. That's what parallax strips does. Like that. And if we come back to the digital damage and come down to block and decrease that threshold again, so we can add more and more. Pretty nice. It's actually quite a nice look. And we're going to create a Sapphire Effect preset out of this in a minute. But that's too much for this. I just wanted it to be a little more subtle. And I actually made it even more subtle by using the Sapphire Wipe Rectangle Transition. So by using Wipe Rectangle, which if we can I'll just turn on the border so we can see it. See? So it's masking off the top and the bottom. And I'm using an edge softness. If I just decrease that and turn off the border, then we get a hard line. The border should be 0. We get more of a hard line, but I haven't used the border, and I've also masked that off so it's a little softer. And that way we're just sort of constraining it. So it looks as if these bright light areas are, illuminating the damage, and we're getting a bit of fall off. So it basically falls off into darkness. That was the sort of thinking behind that. And I've used Wipe Rectangle to do that. Some effects don't necessarily work with masking. You have to pre-compose them. And in those cases, I often use a transition to mask. Very nice. So you get those nice little details in there. And using the warp transform at the same angle just makes them feel nicely integrated into that grid. All right, so let's take a look at the final look. All right, so let's finish this off by looking at how you could create a Sapphire Effect Builder preset. But I'm going to show you something a little different from what I've shown in other tutorials. Sometimes when you're working, you start without Sapphire Effect. So you start with individual effects, exactly like I have here. I haven't used Sapphire Effect at all for this particular look. But I think it would be quite useful to have a combination of these individual effects inside one Sapphire Effect preset for future use. So I'm going to show you how you can use what you've already created and create a Sapphire Effect Builder preset. So all of the effects that we want to use are on the damage layer. We're going to combine those into one effect. So in order to use the settings that we already have, what we have to do is create temp presets. So I'm going to click on grid first, click on save preset, and just type in temp GG. Maybe I can just save that text and click save. So grid is the first one, and then we have digital damage. Just paste in my temp, DD, save. We use warp transform, WT, and parallax strips. PS. Save. All right. So we can turn that layer off. What we'll do is we'll create a new solid. Just make this black. And we'll add Sapphire Effect. Just do a search for S_effect. And we'll click on load preset. So we're going to start with our grid, but we'll just do a search for temp underscore. There's grid, double click. And we'll just solo this layer. You can see the grid is working already. So now we'll click Edit Effect. And let's just add the other ones. So we have to choose node, insert node from preset, and just do this a couple of times. So temp, next is digital damage, node, insert node from preset. Next is warp transform. We can't do them all at once just yet. And don't click load because that will load an individual preset. Insert node from preset, temp, and parallax strips. That's basically it. It's got all of the settings. Obviously it's very subtle because, as we saw before, the digital damage block noise is quite low. So if we just take that threshold down, we should be able to see a lot more. Here we go. A lot more. And I'm going to bring that up a bit just to find a bit of a sweet spot. Maybe something like that. So before we save this as a preset, of course, just making the, I can take the mask off there, just making the parameters visible in the host that we want. So I just turn them all off. Maybe the boxes would be good for grid, and digital damage, maybe nothing but the block noise details, maybe intensity and threshold. Warp transform, don't need to see any of that. Parallax strips, possibly the size. I'm going to go through and modify this myself because I want to save this as a preset for the next version of Sapphire and maybe make some variations as well. You can choose whichever you want. Once you've got that, you can save that as a preset. So I'll call this temp Sapphire effect. I'm not going to do anything else with that. Just click save, click OK. And back here in the host, there you can see there's all the effects together. And there's the parameters that I've made available in the host. And it's good to go. So, working as expected and ready to use on any project that I have coming up. Rather than having to, I could save presets for all of those individual effects, but if I want to build this again, I'd have to save, apply them all one by one. So having Effect Builder to be able to do this is fantastic. So hopefully you found that useful. Please leave a comment if you have any questions or you'd like me to dive into anything deeper. To learn more about Sapphire, visit borisfx.com, where you can also download a free trial. For now, this is John. I'll see you in the next tutorial.